said, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Be water, my friend.
Hello, everyone. Now for the third time, the two of us. You hopefully will only see us for the first time now. And I'm here at the Biocybernaut Institute, and I'm super excited to be here with Dr. James Hardt.
Welcome. Welcome to Biocybernaut Institute Deutschland. You have an amazing week ahead of you.
Yeah, thank you. I gotta say, I'm excited on the one hand, but like I told you before, a little bit nervous, and we'll get into that in a minute because this is something very special.
Well, it's absolutely appropriate to be a little bit excited and a little bit nervous because many people change only when they have to. And so you know enough about Biocybernaut to know that powerful, transformative change will happen. And knowing that, there's got to be some part of you, your ego or whatever, which is a little bit nervous about that. And so into that nervousness, we will provide love and information, and you will learn more about yourself in this week than you probably have in the last 7 years. The information density will be high, very high information density.
How come 7 years?
Well, it's 7 days.
Ah, okay.
Okay, you're going to be here 7 days, and probably, I know you've been a biohacker and you work on yourself, and here you have a technology and a method that will allow you to enormously accelerate your development of your consciousness and your self-understanding.
Wow, yeah, that's exciting. Well, I've actually heard about you years ago, which I haven't really noticed. I didn't make the connection until recently because I found some early blog articles and about the program and was eager to try it out then. But it's something, yeah, that, like you said, maybe the ego told me, okay, maybe that's not a good idea. They might manipulate you. And I think there are some fears associated with that. And I'd like to address that.
Sure,
Let's
address that.
Because I know now with neurofeedback that you're actually not like, doing something with the brain, but that you help the person do something with her or his brain. Mm-hmm. But first of all, a couple steps back, because sure. I just, again, want to hear that story, how you made it all over. And I guess you're originally from Canada as well, or from the United States?
U.S. citizen, permanent resident of Germany, and permanent resident of Canada. So I have training centers in the U.S., in Canada, and here in das Vaterland. Alle meine Großeltern stammten aus Deutschland.
Ah, okay.
So to me, it is a homecoming.
But still, how did you find that place?
How did we come here?
Here.
Okay. Well, I have a very dear friend, a world-famous spiritual teacher named Drunvalo Melchizedek. And he has had a school of remembering with over 500 teachers teaching his courses. One of these was a Dutchman named Tom de Winter. And in perhaps 2007, Tom de Winter was at my then California training center doing his Alpha-1 training. He absolutely loved it. Tom de Winter is a personal growth leader, a spiritual teacher. He leads men's groups, he leads consciousness groups. And on the third day of his 7-day Alpha-1 training, he was so enamored of the process. He said, "Would you bring this to Europe?" And I said, "Yes, show me the building." He said, "Well, in Amsterdam, he has a big house, large enough for the whole training center. We had, I think, 6,000 square feet in the training center. Plus, he had rooms where people could stay, which would be very convenient." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Well, Tom, that sounds wonderful. What is the elevation?" And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "What's the elevation related to sea level?" Oh, he goes, "It's 5 meters below sea level." At the time, I believed in global warming. I no longer believe in global warming because I know that we're going into a grand solar minimum, and it's going to become much colder as we go into, last time it happened was 400 years ago, 1645 to 1715, and they called it the Little Ice Age here in Europe. The Black Sea in Russia froze year-round. The River Thames in London froze for the first time in history. There was mass starvation, a mass migration to the south, and we're going into another one of those periods. In fact, it will be so cold at the bottom of the cycle, 2028 to 2033, that there will be no food grown outdoors north of the 45th parallel, which includes all of Germany, part of France, none of Spain. You'll still be able to grow food in Spain, England, Scotland, Wales, Denmark, Norway, Finland, most of Russia. No food grown outdoors. So anyway,
How long might that take until that happens?
Well, it's actually in process right now. As we go into solar cycle 25, it's actually going to be weaker than the Dalton minimum, which had the coldest year was 1816. They called it the year without a summer. And so we just finished cycle 24, and we're going into solar cycle number 25. And so we can, like this year, 19 million farm acres in America were not even planted because it was too wet. The cloudiness that comes from the grand solar minimum, and we could go into that separately if you like another time, because it has to do with weakening of the solar magnetic field, which leads to increased flux of cosmic rays coming into the inner solar system, hitting the upper atmosphere of Earth, forming the seed particles of clouds, which then make it cloudier, wetter, and colder. And so 200 years ago, the British astronomer Edmund Herschel knew that there was a negative correlation between the number of sunspots and the price of wheat. When there were a lot of sunspots, it was warm, a lot of food, the price of wheat was low. In periods of no sunspots or few sunspots, it was colder and there was less food produced. And so the price of wheat went up. So negative correlation between sunspots and the price of food. Anyway, so that at the time, I believed in global warming. And for example, one time in the past, all of the ice on Greenland melted in about 10 years. That raised the ocean levels 22 feet. Well, if Tom DeWinter's house was 5 meters below sea level, and I was anticipating, the ocean rising rapidly, I said, no, Tom. He goes, okay, I'll sell my house. And he set the intention. You'll learn on day 2 or 3 of your training, we will introduce the process of intentions, where you write out what your intention is, and then you and Anoop and Edward and Miguel and I will support each person's intention as we go through a process. You'll learn how we do that. And so Tom set the intention to sell his house. When he returned to Amsterdam, there were 10 messages on his voice box, answering service, from a man who wanted to buy his house. He was busy. He'd been away for a while. He didn't call back. Next day, the guy called and left more messages. So Tom realized the man is serious. So he called his realtor and he said, what should I sell my house for? The guy gave him a number. We'll call it X. The third day, the guy called back and offered him 3 times X. So he sold his house. 2 months later, the real estate market crashed, but now Tom has a big pocket full of euros, and he's wandering around Europe, and he finds this place, which was a farmhouse. The rest of the house had just been renovated into a retreat center by the previous owner, and here, the Biocybernaut Center was the stable. And so with Miguel and his brother and several cousins, we built the training center here, the Biocybernaut Training Center. So once Tom had bought the house, he called me to fly over from the U.S., showed me the building, and I said, yeah, we can do it. It'll work. And so it was a gift.
Wow, what a story. And now we're actually at the Bavarian, well, not Bavarian, actually, we're in Allgäu, which is part Bavarian, part Baden-Württemberg. And I didn't know that actually before coming here. I thought Allgäu was only Bavarian. Sorry to all the Allgäuers.
Well, I'm fond of saying that Bavarians think they're more German than Germans, and the Allgäuer think they're more Bavarian than Bavarian.
That might be actually be true. But anyway, so you have 3 centers now. One in the US in Sedona,
Arizona.
the other one in Canada. Where's that one?
Well, if I may, the current Canadian center is in Victoria, British Columbia, which is out on Vancouver Island off the North American mainland. When I bought the place in December of 2006, I did not know about the Cascadia earthquake fault, which has the capability of making earthquakes more than 1,000 times bigger than the famous San Andreas fault in California. And so I received guidance in March of last year to get out of there. We're coming up on probably the next break. The last time the Cascadia fault broke was January 31 of the year 1700. We know the exact date because there was a huge tidal wave produced that killed all the coastal Indians in Canada and California, North America, Oregon and Washington. 24 hours later, when that tidal wave reached Japan, it wiped out the eastern coastal cities of Japan. And Japanese keep good records, so the people inland who survived, that's how we know the exact date. And so it can produce up to 9.3 earthquakes. The San Andreas can only produce up to about 8. And so when you go from 8 to 9, it's more than 1,000 times more destructive energy. So there's an interesting story about that, if I may. I was doing an advanced training with one of my trainers, Linda Coldaway. She's Canadian. And I was taking, for the second or third time, the Alpha-5 training. There's 24 levels of the Alpha, and I was doing a shortened 5-day version of the Alpha-5. And on day 3, you know how in the newspapers, when somebody speaks, there's like a balloon that comes out of their head and the words are in there? Well, there was a balloon. I was sitting across the table from Linda, and there was a balloon that came out of the left side of her head, had a big house in it and a forest behind it, beautiful green forest. And I knew somehow that that was near Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which is 1,000 kilometers inland from Victoria. And so I said, what do you know about Calgary? And she said, oh, my mother lives there. And she says, I'm feeling a little guilty because I haven't seen her for a year. And I said, Linda, the morning after this training ends, you and I are going to have breakfast with your mother. And she goes, what? So I told her about the picture of the house. And this was after I had received guidance to get out of there from reading in the Akashic Records, which we can talk about the brainwaves. Theta brainwaves enable people to read in the Akashic Records. And so my former groundskeeper, handyman, had gone into real estate. Danny Cox, we called him up and said, Danny, do you know any realtors in Calgary? Yes, he did. So he gave us a name. We called them up that night. They sent 11 listings. We picked 4 or 5. We had breakfast the morning of the 6th day with Linda's mother. The realtor showed up at the restaurant, and we went and looked at houses. The second one we saw is the location of the future Biocybernaut Institute of Canada. It has 18.4 acres. It has 2 lakes. One of the lakes has an island in it. It's secluded. It's very beautiful. And it's 1,000 kilometers from the Cascadia Fault. And I just came from there. I was working on, developing it. When I bought the building in Victoria, it took me almost 2 years to renovate it to the point that it would be ready to receive the chambers and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's coming.
Okay. Thank you. And by this point, actually, we should explain to people who might have not a very good idea of what Biocybernaut does and what a training looks like. I think I would love to have you tell that story, explain what Biocybernaut actually is and what the training is. Mm-hmm. And then I would like to go into your book and the process of neurofeedback and how that actually works.
Wonderful.
But then,
you're so organized.
Well, you can't say that now after we started 3 times.
Well, the third time is a charm. Third time is a charm. Okay, so what is Biocybernaut? Well, a Biocybernaut is to inner space what an astronaut is to outer space. And wir haben hier 5 inner Raumschiffen, inner spaceships. And so people sometimes, you mentioned it when you arrived, you know that sometimes people are a little nervous about working with their brain. Like, will we do something to your brain? The answer is no. It's like a mirror for your mind. Now, you could stand in front of a mirror all day and the mirror will not make you smile. But if you want to practice your smile, a mirror is a perfect feedback device to use. So you pull the muscles, you make an intention, you pull the muscles of your face in various ways, you look in the mirror and you get instant feedback. And so with that feedback, you can perfect your smile. And you can have different kinds of smiles. You can have a little bit of a smile. You can have a broad, generous smile. You can have a medium smile. And so you know exactly how to make the smile that's perfect for every situation. Now, we might also jump to notice that, well, how do you know what's perfect? Well, it requires emotional intelligence to know what response would be appropriate in a given situation. And the emotional intelligence from the Alpha-1 training, the double premium, goes up 15.8 points. This is unheard of in emotional intelligence research. Maybe 1 week. Average increase of 15.8 points. Now, you will later today take the emotional intelligence test by Dr. Travis Bradbury and Janine Greaves, who are the authors of the book Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And so there's an online test. And so we give that day 1, or like this is day 0. And then we give it again at the end, on the end of the 7th day. And the average increase, now men typically are a little lower in emotional intelligence than women. Of course, that doesn't apply if men have been doing a lot of personal growth work. But what happens in the course of the week is both men and women increase in emotional intelligence, such that at the end of the week, there's no statistically significant difference between the emotional intelligence of men and women. And so by having increased emotional intelligence, you'll know exactly what type of smile to bring forth in any given situation. You also know what words to say and what body language to use, because you will not only be more in control and aware of your own emotions, but you'll be aware of other people's emotions and thus better able to adapt your communications so that they are best received by others.
Okay. And now when you say that, I think that's a really nice image to look into a mirror and to then be able to train your smile. But how does that look like for someone who won't see me tomorrow, let's say in the chamber? Like, what will happen to me?
Oh, okay. All right. So a little outline of what happens. So you and your 2 fellow trainees will show up at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. We will have done the orientation and the demonstration in the chamber today. Miguel will measure your heads and put your electrodes on. The electrodes are hanging over there on the wall. They're gold disc electrodes, and they'll be very carefully attached to your head in ways that they're stable for, 10, 12 hours, continue to give good recordings. And they disappear. You actually forget they're there. There's no pressure. Okay, so then you go into the chamber and you're plugged in. And the first thing you do is you take your first mood scale of the day. I wrote this computer program years ago, and it displays adjectives. It can run in English or German or French or Spanish or Italian or Russian or Chinese, many different languages. And so words appear on the screen one at a time, like friendly. And you push a button to indicate how much you're feeling that. 0 would be not at all, 1's a little, 2's moderately, 3's quite a bit, and 4 is extremely. And then the next word shows up. And so these are standard psychological tests to measure mood, and the computer will score them. But in addition, because you're doing it in the chamber, while your brain waves are being recorded, the computer can actually make a determination of the accuracy of each one of your answers. And so let's say the word is angry, and you put 0. The computer can express its doubt about the accuracy if it gives you 1 standard deviation or 1 sigma. There's a 68% chance that answer is wrong. If you get a 2 sigma, that's a 95% chance the answer is wrong. 3 sigmas, a 99.7% chance the answer is wrong, and sigmas can go up from there. And so...
Am I shown the result? Or?
Well, not at the time. You just go through the test, word after word, and there's hundreds of them. And so it scores your moods, 21 different moods: friendly, clear thinking, sleepy, unhappy, dizzy, anger, hostility, depression, sadness, vigor. And so we, of course, look at how your emotions change as you increase your alpha. When on the morning of the second day, when you come in, while Miguel is putting your electrodes on, we will go over your mood scales, review the results. Now, the mood scales are a little bit like, let's say you have a farmer has a field, but the field has rocks in it. And so in order to really work with that field, he needs to dig up the rocks. And so buried in everyone's mind, sometimes forgotten, are traumas. Mm-hmm. And so the mood scales are like a plow that goes across the landscape of the mind, turning up the rocks. So let's say the word is angry. And so you said no, but then the computer says, well, it detects there's anger there. So then as a trainer, I would ask you, okay, well, what are you angry about? And so maybe your lip trembles a little, maybe a tear comes out of your eye, and then you tell a story about somebody who did something bad to you. They lied to you, they cheated to you, they stole from you, they broke your heart, whatever it was. And so that person then goes on your forgiveness list. And we have a 14-step method for forgiveness. It turns out forgiveness is only effective if you do it under conditions of rising alpha. And so the protocol is set up in such a way that you know if your alpha is going up or down. And so, but we'll get into that. We don't need to explain it in detail now. But there is a 14-step method for forgiveness that allows people to forgive what they previously might have thought was unforgivable. Okay? And that's liberating and freeing, and people feel lighter and filled with joy when they can do this. Okay, so that's the first part of the day. You do your mood scales. Then, when everybody finishes, then we do 3 baselines. One is an eyes open baseline. The lights are on, the doors are open, and on the wall in front of you in the chamber is a round circle, white circle, and you just focus on that. Then we close the door, turn out the lights, and we ask you to do an eyes closed baseline. These are brief. Then there's a third baseline, which is white noise, where you hear white noise, which is like shh. And within the white noise, at random intervals, are beeps, beep signals. And so your task is to count the beeps. A purely mental task. You're not supposed to count on your fingers or your toes. And so at the end, Miguel will call in to each person and ask how many beeps you counted. Then we do the first feedback task, which is alpha suppression. So you hear these sounds, which get louder as you make more alpha. They get quieter as you make less alpha. You have different electrodes on the head, and there's a different note for each head location. Bum, 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 for the first 4. And then every 2 minutes, the musical tones stop, and for 8 seconds, the screen lights up and shows you your scores. So you can see how well you're doing. Now, the first task is to learn to lower your alpha. How to quiet it, how to quiet the tones, lower your alpha. Then there's a bathroom break, and then you go back into the chamber, and then you do the first alpha enhancement session where the feedback is the same, the musical sounds, and every 2 minutes you get the scores that show up for 8 seconds. But now the goal is to raise your alpha, to make the tones louder, to get higher scores. At the end of that, there's a second mood scale. Only now the instructions are, how did you feel in your moments of highest alpha? The first one is, how did you feel right now? But the second one is, how did you feel in your moments of highest alpha? Then you come out and we have a lunch. You go back in, because this is the premium double training, and you do a second session of alpha enhancement, where the goal is to raise your alpha, make louder tones, higher scores. At the end of that, there's a third mood scale, where again you report, how did you feel in the moments of highest alpha? Then you do the 3 baselines in reverse order: white noise, eyes closed, eyes open. Then you come out of the chamber, stop at the restroom probably, take a wet paper towel and wipe the paste off your ears. And then you go to the canopy room and pick one of the Himmelbetten, one of the canopied beds, and you can sit or lie. And as the trainer, I'll come in, and then each person will be interviewed about their chamber experiences. And they could be, quite range. I mean, it's actually fairly common for people a couple days into the training to begin to have out-of-body experience. And that might begin where they feel a little light in the chair. Of course, if you focus on it, then it goes away. So you kind of look at it out of the corner of your mind's eye and you continue doing what you're doing, and you may actually have out-of-body experience. There's other experiences that people can have. There's a brainwave pattern that we call angel pattern. And anybody who's ever had that, when I ask them, do you see angels? They always say yes. One of them was, you may know that I did a project with U.S. Army Green Berets, where I moved the technology to a secret Army base, and I had the privilege to train 24 of these elite athletes, real peak performers. And I measured their baselines sometime before the training started. I taught them how to put on each other's electrodes, because there were a lot of them. And I only had one technician, the company clerk, who I trained. And so then I had a private interview with each one after they had done the baseline. And with one of the 24, I saw the pattern of central alpha being higher than occipital alpha. And 80% of all humans have their biggest alpha at the occipitals. So it's quite unusual for somebody to have centrals bigger. And they have to be big enough. The occipitals have to be at least this high, and the centrals need to be higher. Mm-hmm. And so you could imagine like this big skinhead killer dude sitting across the table from me, all muscular and buffed. And so I lean forward and I say to him, do you talk to beings that other people don't see? And it was like I hit him with a 2x4, because he went back in his chair. He almost tipped over. He's having an anxiety attack. He's hyperventilating. Like, how do you know? And he said, and I said, well, I see it in the numbers. He said, I've only told my best buddy on pain of death if he would ever tell anybody. How do you know? And I said, well, I see it in your numbers. And then he said, well, when I'm doing my martial arts training, there's this old Asian martial arts master. He shows up and he coaches me, and nobody else can see him. And so across a very wide range, this was not what you would call a spiritual devotee. He's a warrior, a fierce, powerful, strong, effective warrior. And yet he had the brainwave pattern for seeing angels, and he had an Asian martial arts master who would show up to coach him. And so this is reliable across men, women, children. And sometimes people come in and they don't have the pattern, but they develop it in the course of the week. One of them this happened to, was an American football player, a very powerful athlete. He was so good, he was a part of the San Francisco 49er football team, and he had played in 2 Super Bowls. He showed me one of the rings, which is this huge gold, platinum, diamond-encrusted ring that you get for playing in the Super Bowl. And he did not have this pattern. But on day 5, the centrals rose dramatically. My technician came running. Jim, you got to see this. I came in, looked at the polygraph, and looked at the scores. I said, this is going to be a very interesting interview. Now, when he came out of the chamber, he was terrified. I can't say he was white as a sheet, because he was a big black guy, but he was terrified because 3 angels had showed up in the chamber and went, "You haven't been living a very good life." And he's going, "Ah," like that. And so, of course, he had, very forgiveness. He even stopped drinking coffee off of this experience.
But how do you explain that the alpha is responsible for the angels? Is it a correlation between the alpha there and some other activities or neurochemicals being released?
Well, the simplest way for the layman is to note that, let's say you have a radio receiver, and when you tune it, you pick up different channels, or like a television. You can tune in channel 2 or channel 7, and one might be the History Channel, one might be, the Playboy Channel, one might be CNN, and so, or the news. And so when you tune your brain in this way, you literally tune in to another channel of reality. There are many, many channels of reality.
Crazy. Okay, well explained. And now you mentioned alpha already a couple of times, and now we are at an important part also in the book, which goes into the different brain waves. And I really like that example of that we live in a beta world, in a way. And so we go from delta, which is the brainwave active in deep sleep, to almost overdrive. You explain that in the book. So we jump the theta and alpha and go straight to beta.
Yep.
And
right, tossing. Okay, you're asleep in delta. Then the alarm goes off. You haven't had enough sleep. You wake up. You're foggy, so you toss down a bunch of caffeine, and you skip theta, you skip alpha, and you go right into full-on high-stress beta. And so if we were to look at these brainwaves as gears of a car, delta's first gear, theta's second gear, alpha's third gear, and beta's fourth gear, people are driving their brains jumping from delta, first gear, to beta, fourth gear. And then at night, maybe they take alcohol, they take a sleeping pill, and they put themselves to sleep, missing these important inner states. Well, if you have a car with 4 speeds and you shift from first to fourth gear, and then from fourth gear to first gear, you will have problems. You'll have low gas mileage, and you'll have high repair bills. Running your brain this way, driving your brain this way, you have high medical costs and low productivity.
And how come that our brain, you mentioned the ego before, but why do we skip those important brainwaves that make us actually feel so good and make us introspective? Like, how is that a phenomenon of our modern world, or has that been like that for a long time?
Well, recently I heard someone talking about when coffee was introduced to Western civilization. Before that, because the water was generally not safe to drink, people drank beer, and so they were half drunk all day long. And so when coffee was introduced, you boil the water so it cleans the water, and then you put the coffee in. And so people went from being drunk all day to being stressed all day in beta. And so you can probably get certain kinds of things, you get more done in beta than you do if you're drunk. But the ideal is the alpha state, which is a flow state. It's a state in which you can be in the zone. Everything that you do seems effortless, seems natural. Your creativity is heightened. It's the Flowgrade brainwave.
That's it. That's actually exactly what I thought when reading that. I mean, so many times I jumped into my eyes and I said, wow, this is actually exactly what I had in mind when I created Flowgrade. Being a basketball player, I called it to be, in the zone. I played in the NCAA in college in the US, Boston University. And I had that experience there because I was actually, I'm someone who receives a lot of input from like sensory input, and especially on the court that overwhelmed me sometimes. And it actually caused me to become aggressive because the coach is shouting, the crowd's shouting at you. And for me, the only way to really play that game on a high level was to go into tunnel vision, to really blend out everything else. And that was, for me, what I called to be in the zone then, and then later to be in a flow state. And then, when when I said, actually, this is the state that I want people to have more often of. And I saw a statistic that only, I think, 1 out of 5 people regularly gets into some sort of flow state, which is really little. And then, and then I came across that and I said, wow, this is the high level flow grading that gets you there in a very short time. And maybe like how that's something that I'm very interested in, that story of how you got into contact with that technology and using it in order to enhance the brain.
Very happy to tell the story. As a preface to that, Greg Stewart, who was an Alpha trainee, came to the training center in California. He was the first one to sign up for what we call the Diamond Dozen Club, where he prepaid for a dozen trainings, 12 trainings, and got a 20% discount. So he did both Alpha and Theta trainings as a part of that. And he found and gave to me a book called Primal Branding. And it's a book that talks about the 7 characteristics that are present in any technology or process that goes global. And one of those is an intriguing founder story. And so the idea that there is an intriguing founder story is a part and parcel. It's how Biocybernaut got started. Let's pause for a moment. Okay. Well, I was a senior in my senior year in physics. I was majoring in physics at Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was the fall semester, and I came out of the student union after lunch, and there was a big sign. Every letter was hand-painted, and every letter was a slightly different color. And it said, Dr. Joe Kamiya will talk on brainwaves and consciousness, and it gave a time that was, that's just 10 minutes. The building was right over here, and I didn't have a class. So I went. And Dr. Kamiya was talking. He was the person who discovered and reported in April of 1962 at a Western Psychological Association meeting in San Francisco that people could voluntarily control their own brainwaves. Now, brainwaves had been discovered by an Austrian psychiatrist named Herr Dr. Hans Berger in 1908. And there's a very cool story. He was actually looking for the source of ESP. He had been recruited by the Austro-Hungarian army to fight in one of the interminable wars in the Crimea. Because he was educated, he was made an officer and given a horse. And in one of the battles, the horse was shot and fell on him and broke his leg. And he spent many long months in a militärisches Krankenhaus, military hospital, recovering. When he got back home to Vienna, he called his whole family together to tell them his story. He's only halfway through the story, and his sister interrupted him, took him in the family house to her bedroom, and brought out her Tagebuch, her diary. And in there, she had written every detail of everything that had happened to him. Now, now it's interesting. Beautiful here. He was born in Bavaria. When when René Descartes dreamed up science, the rational mind was enshrined. And other forms of mental awareness, like intuition, were pushed out. Women were allowed to have intuition. In fact, it was called women's intuition. But men were just supposed to be logical. If a man had an intuition, he could say, well, I'll have a gut feeling or have a hunch. But intuition was banished, by and large, from the male society. And except in Bavaria. Bavaria had very deep mystical roots. Hans Berger was born in Bavaria, and he grew up with an awareness of and an appreciation for the numinous, the transcendent, the magical. And so now he's Herr Dr. Hans Berger, but he has this experience now where it's obvious that his sister had a telepathic connection with him during the battle and when he was in the hospital, because she had every detail. And so he had heard that there was a Frenchman named Volta who had discovered electricity. If he put an electric voltage on a frog's leg, it would jump. And so he went looking for electrical waves in the brain with a purpose to find the source of ESP, extrasensory perception or telepathy. That was his goal. Now, his equipment was very primitive, you might imagine, in 1908. And so he used a ballistic galvanometer with a needle sticking out and then a magic lantern. He projected it on the screen, and from the other side of the screen, you could see a little wiggle. He called them alpha waves. They're not the fastest, they're not the slowest, but they're the biggest. Because they were the biggest waves in the brain, they were the first to be found with his very primitive technology. And he actually spent 10 years researching alpha brainwaves in secret, looking for the source of ESP. With his primitive technology, he couldn't find it. But he did do some very good work. He knew that high anxiety people had lower alpha. And so, but nobody, and then when he published in 1918, it created a sensation. Brainwave recordings spread to universities and hospitals all over Europe, Moscow, England, Berlin, then to the US, New York, Los Angeles, to Australia. And it became a standard part of medicine to measure brainwaves, to determine success and health of the individual. And so, but not until 1962 did Dr. Joe Kamiya, a Japanese-American scientist working at the University of California, San Francisco, he accidentally discovered that people could voluntarily control their own brainwaves. He was a sleep researcher, and he had moved recently from the University of Chicago to University of California, San Francisco. And he would have like a young college student lying on a cot next to the polygraph, brainwaves measuring, the pens are wiggling, the paper is moving. And if he'd see a big burst of alpha waves, he'd go, wow. And then there'd maybe be another one. And if he went, wow, there'd be another one. So he somehow got the idea that maybe the feedback that he was giving was somehow contributing to. So then he took a little bell. He'd see an alpha wave, he'd ring a bell. And then he actually automated the system with electronics. And so it was an absolute sensation when he reported in 1962 that humans could, with feedback, voluntarily control their own brainwaves. People went, oh my God, electronic Zen, and people were very excited. Now, when I came into the field in 1974 as a graduate student, 90% of all published studies showed that people could not learn to control their alpha waves. And as I looked at the ones that did, the ones that didn't, and I'd also had my own experience, I'll jump back to that in a minute, at Joe Kamiya's lab, so I knew what was possible. It turned out to be methodology. People were using the wrong measures. They were using percent time rather than integrated amplitude. They were having people lie down or, training with their eyes open. I mean, a whole bunch of, there's 100 dozen ways to do it wrong and only a few ways to do it right. So now I have this class that Dr. Kamiya gives. I was so fascinated. I had a friend who was studying a grad student in psychology at Duquesne University, and they had some French Jesuit priests there who were teaching phenomenology or the science of consciousness, but there was no way to measure it. It was all just talk, interesting, fascinating, philosophical talk, but there was no data. There was no hard data. Suddenly I discover brainwaves. This is the data by which we can quantify consciousness. So I went to the library, spent my senior year, every spare minute I was in the library reading the history of brainwave research. And so in the spring, when I graduated with a bachelor's degree in physics, I jumped on my Triumph motorcycle and I rode across North America, actually went up into Canada, across North America and down to San Francisco. And I showed up in Joe Kamiya's lab and I volunteered as a research subject. It was very primitive. One electrode in the middle of the back of the head, an ear clip reference, a ground on the forehead, one score, one 3-digit score, and one tone, feedback tone. And it was the most fascinating thing I had ever done in my life. And I went back the next day and the next day. I had 3 days of this. Absolutely fascinating. And so, of course, I wanted more. I went back on the 4th day, but they weren't doing any studies. However, I had met Dr. Kamiya's girlfriend, Joanne Gardner, who worked in the lab. And I went to her office, very polite, and I said, Joanne, I'd really love it if you'd put some electrodes on me and put me in the chamber so I could play. She goes, okay. Took me downstairs, wired me up, put me in the chamber. Didn't turn on the polygraph because I was nobody's data. You know, if you run a polygraph, you have to feed the inkwells, the paper jams, you know. But the scores were generated. Then she went upstairs, got involved in her work, and she forgot I was there. Later, lunchtime came, and she went with 9 other people in Paul Gorman's VW camper van out to a Chinese lunch. And in course number 11 of a 12-course Chinese lunch, she went, oh my God. And she's, oh, there's somebody in the chamber. So they all rushed out of the restaurant, raced across town, ran up to the building, went in, ripped open the door of the chamber, and interrupted the late stages of a most incredible adventure, without which I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be doing this. I would have been a physicist somewhere in a lab. And so,
in exactly
well,
11?
well, one thing was that my alpha increased a full order of magnitude over the course of maybe 4 hours in the chamber. Now I was a Protestant fundamentalist, Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. My father's father was a Lutheran minister. He married my parents. He baptized me. I had a very heavy dose of Christian fundamentalism. I had never taken any drugs. I didn't know what meditation was. And so, but there I am. I'm having out-of-body experience. I'm flying around the universe. I'm having ego disintegration. I'm meeting up with discorporate entities, consciousnesses that didn't have bodies. Some of them were benign. Some of them were a little scary. And so when the door opened and there's these 10 people standing there, they bring me out and then they say, well, what happened? So as I'm telling them the details of what happened, and this is all written down in a paper that I published in Michael Hutchison's Mega Brain report called A Tale of Self-Discovery, where I give the first-person account of all of the things that happened. Paul Gorman, who with his wife had toured India the summer before in that same VW camper van, as I would say something, he would say, oh, that's a meditation experience. I would say something else. He'd go, oh, that's a meditation experience. So I'm being taught that what had happened to me are things that normally only happen in advanced meditation. And I was so high, so out of body, that for the next 3 days when I walked around, my feet were like 1/2 meter off the ground. I wasn't really back in my body. But then I figured, okay, now this is so profound, this is somehow going to be my life. So summer was almost over, so I got back on my Triumph motorcycle and I rode back across America. It was like flying. And I showed up at now Carnegie Mellon University. It had changed its name over the summer. And I said, I want to register for grad school in psychology. I figured I was going to be dealing with weird stuff. So I needed to get my rational mind stamped with some kind of seal of approval so people would take seriously the weird stuff that I was going to be doing and talking about. And we say at Biocybernaut, weird is wonderful. And so you will discover as you go through your 7 days of your Alpha-1 training that you will have experiences that you maybe have heard about, read about, but maybe never personally experienced before. Now, so I registered for grad school. And then at this point, I had no idea what had happened to me. It was like this fantastic thing. And everybody, I wanted to tell them what happened. So up above Carnegie Mellon's campus on the hill was a big home from the robber baron era of Pittsburgh's history. Like, to give you an example, the top floor had quarters for 11 maids. This is a very, very big house. And it was rented by Dr. Rolf von Eckertsberg, one of the professors of phenomenological psychology at Duquesne University. Now, he had lived, oh dear, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So briefly, Timothy Leary and Dr. Leary and Dr. Richard Alpert were professors at Harvard University. And they started to do research on psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, and they frightened the rather conservative members of the department, and they were both thrown out of Harvard. Now, then the paths diverged. Timothy Leary continued to be an advocate for psychedelics. he frightened the establishment. At one point, somebody planted 6 marijuana seeds in the carpet of the passenger side of his car, and they used that as an excuse to put him in jail for 20 years.
Wow.
He came out, he died soon thereafter. Whereas Dr. Alpert went to India, and he found a guru. And he then came back and taught probably 3 generations of Westerners, Western Europeans, Americans, Canadians, about the most beautiful and profound parts of Indian philosophy and Indian psychology and meditation and consciousness, but using his gifts of language and his understanding of the mind from the perspective of a Harvard psychologist, he was able to interpret all of this into language that Westerners could understand. And so I knew that Dr. Rolf von Eckertsburg, had been a grad student at Harvard under Timothy Leary, and I knew that he'd taken lots of LSD. And so I figured, well, if anybody knows what happened to me, it'll be Rolf. So immediately after registering for grad school, I walk up the hill, 10 minutes, I enter his house, and I walk into his office, and he looks at me, and he sees that I'm profoundly different. And he goes, sit down. Then he takes one hand and he sweeps everything off of his desk, and he folds his hands like this, and he said, okay, tell me what happened. And I tell him this story.
Without you having said anything beforehand.
He just saw me. He could see I was different. He was very high consciousness. And so I told this, and this is a story that I told. It's written in the Michael Hutchison's Mega Brain Reports, A Tale of Self-Discovery. So at the end of maybe 3 hours, and one interesting thing happened. Halfway through my talk, his neighbor lady walked in. She stood respectfully in the distance, listening for maybe half an hour. Then she left, and she came back, and she put right next to me the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. Now, if I had seen that a month earlier, I would have looked at it, nonsense, I would have thrown it away. But I took it, I read it, I gave it to my roommate who's very spiritual. He ordered the Yogananda correspondence lessons. We did 5 years of the Yogananda lessons. We were both initiated into Kriya Yoga. And so, that was like a sub-theme that was going on in the background. So, but at the end of this talk with Rolf, he folded his hands, he said, well, we can do that here. Oh my God, yes, we can do that here. Because I had just registered for grad school. There was one soundproof chamber. There was a pile of old electronic equipment that I knew with my degree in physics. I could cobble it together in such a way that I could make a brainwave training laboratory there. So I decided I was going to do that. So the first thing I did was I had to get a master's degree. I did that in 1 year. And then I applied for permission to use the electrophysiological equipment. I was referred to Dr. Terence W. Barrett, a new postdoc. It was his first job. And I talked to him about the brainwaves of consciousness. Like, for example, in a book edited by Charles Hardt, published in 1970, there was an article about yogis in India who were measured their brainwaves in samadhi, super high alpha all over the head. There was another paper in there about measuring Zen monks in satori, again, very high alpha all over the head. Now, there were differences. One of the differences in the high alpha, we talk about a flow state. Well, when you take a flow state to the ultimate, what you get to is samadhi or to satori. And so I've been to India several times to study brainwaves on the gurus, and also we've had people achieve satori in the training chambers.
I've actually done a Siddha Samadhi yoga retreat in Pune.
In Pune with Rajneesh? Or after Rajneesh?
I'm not sure.
Osho?
No, not Osho. That was, I would have loved to do it with Osho. But it was, I'm not sure if it was Rajneesh. But is he the bigger guy with the long beard? And well, they all look like that. But a bald head and really charismatic.
I don't know about the bald head.
No, it was not Rajneesh.
Yeah.
I forgot. He was really famous. He actually had passed away shortly after I was there.
Well, I met a number of gurus while I was there.
I'll find out.
Okay, super.
It wasn't the Bhagwan. I know that.
Not Bhagwan Rajneesh. Yeah. Okay, so.
But Rajneesh, you meant Osho.
Osho, yeah.
But, okay, no, it wasn't him.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
He was
no.
Rajneesh before he became Osho.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I applied for permission to use the electrophysiological laboratory to do a doctoral dissertation on studying brainwaves. And Dr. Barrett listened to my telling him about the brainwaves of Satori, the brainwaves of Samadhi. And then he writes a letter. I actually saved it. He said, "Permission denied. Nobody who's interested in consciousness could possibly be serious about getting a PhD in physiological psychology. But," he added, "if you would give up these nonsensical ideas and submit yourself to me, I will design a program which will lead to a degree in physiological psychology." So the dean was absent on sabbatical, but there was a Piagetian psychologist studying child development. So he's interested in development of intelligence, a form of consciousness. So he was the acting dean. I took the letter to him, and he swept that objection away, and I was permitted to do the research. But I had earned the enmity of the entire physiological psychology professors, and they were gunning for me. But I had friends in the department, and so my first study, which was done in 1971, had 20 college students. They were selected to be 10 high anxiety and 10 low anxiety, and I gave them the alpha training. Only one of the high anxiety, because I only was able to give them 20 minutes of feedback a day, total 140 minutes. And with that, all the low anxiety people learned to increase their alpha, but only 12% of the high anxiety people learned. That person, after raising alpha, became a low anxiety person because I gave personality tests before and after. So then I moved on a predoctoral fellowship to San Francisco, and I repeated this study with the wisdom of having done it before, with more measures and everything, in Dr. Kamiya's lab. And longer, more feedback. We also did suppression. And here, 50% of the high anxiety people learned to increase their alpha, and they all became low anxiety. So then in the next study, I increased the training more. And so now we're at the point where we can have 100% of all the people learn to increase their alpha. But there was a learning process of how to do that. Now, I was giving, from the very beginning, personality tests before and after. The paper that I gave you there, if you want to hold that up, was done with Canadian Aboriginals who, because of the racism and the cultural suppression, are more traumatized than returning war veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we were giving personality tests before and after, and we were seeing amazing results. So amazing that when I won a large federal grant, wrote and won, it was entitled Anxiety and Aging, Intervention with EEG Alpha Feedback, because it turns out that this process both reduces anxiety and depression and increases happiness and joy and the ability to enter flow states pretty much at will. But it also reverses aging in the brain. Not just slows it down, not stops it, reverses aging in the brain. So I wrote and won a large federal grant entitled Anxiety and Aging, Intervention with EEG Alpha Feedback. And the target population was women from 60 well up into their 80s. And so when I won this grant, I was elevated from an assistant research psychologist to an assistant professor of medical psychology within the august Department of Psychiatry at University of California, San Francisco. Shortly thereafter, the chairman of the department decreed there would be an annual faculty retreat where you had to go, and each faculty member would have to spend 10 minutes on stage in front of the entire faculty of psychiatry talking about their research. So what I did for my 10 minutes, I prepared slides. When people would take the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, it's like the granddaddy of all personality tests, very reliable, very accurate in discriminating paranoia, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, psychasthenia. It's very good. You show the test profile to a psychiatrist and they can read the person's beads just like that. So I would give this before the training and then on the last day or the day after the training. And of course, 50th percentile is normal. The normal range is 70 to 30, 20 percentile above and below the normal. And I was getting people in the high anxiety group who were 98th and 99th percentile in paranoia and schizophrenia and anxiety and depression. And after 7 days of training, and they took the test again, they were in the middle of the normal zone. Unheard of in psychiatry. And so for my presentation, I'm showing slides. Here's a MMPI profile, before the training and here after. And the results were so shocking that I was only halfway through my 10-minute talk, and 2 senior bearded members of the department were standing up in their chairs, shouting and yelling, shaking their fists, wagging their fingers. Of course, they were afraid. And they couldn't admit they were afraid that I was going to disrupt their profession. So as you learn when we go through the training, if there's fear that you can't deal with, it comes out as anger. Okay? If there's anger you do not acknowledge, it comes out as sadness. And so I was literally shouted off the stage. Academic freedom, right? And so I continued to do the work. I continued.
What year was that?
The grant was awarded in 1979, so it was either 79 or early 1980.
And because you just mentioned that's also in the book with the different, the hierarchy of the different feelings, and joy sort of is the top. Is that something that you came up with, or is that based on?
It was given to me by Deborah Dooley, who was a private practice psychologist in Palo Alto. After she did the training, she came and she was a trainer for me for a while. And she said to me, she said, Jim, I'm not really, she said she was not really a very good psychologist. But because she had this hierarchy where it's apathy at the bottom, sadness and depression, anger, fear, and joy, she said because she knows that hierarchy, she could actually be very effective with people, and we'll teach it to you. We'll do it. We can even go sideways. One point where we had a couple in training, a beautiful young couple, athletic. They had gone helicopter skiing in the backcountry, and the guy skied into a tree and knocked himself unconscious, and he was too heavy for his wife to carry. So she took off her jacket, partially covered him, skied out for help, and by the time they came back with a helicopter to rescue him, he was almost dead. He had serious frostbite. Well, when he recovered consciousness, from that moment, he was angry and yelling at his wife. They went to all different kinds of therapists and counselors. Why would he be angry at this beautiful wife who saved his life? And so, having exhausted all traditional methods, they came to me for training. And they're sitting across the table from me. It's a couple days into the training. And he's yelling at her. Yelling, angry. And at one point, he yelled all his air out, and he had to to take a breath. And in that, while he was going, I said, "What are you afraid of?" And he starts to cry. And he's crying. His wife is holding him, patting him on the back. What had happened, the story came out, was when people die or have a near-death experience, this tunnel opens. They start being drawn down toward the light. They start meeting up with deceased relatives. It's a cross-cultural thing that happens. People report when they come back from a near-death experience. And so this had happened to him. He'd started down the tunnel, and everything was so beautiful that when he was pulled back, he was angry, and he was afraid that he would never have that experience again. And so that fear translated into anger, and that's why he's yelling at his wife. So I assured him that next time he dies, The tunnel will be there. He doesn't have to worry about it. He'll have that experience again. And then he was able to do forgiveness on, his wife for saving his life. He was able to do forgiveness on himself for being angry with her. And so that hierarchy was very powerful and helpful in sort of opening the door for his work.
Can I also ask something more a bit about the different brainwaves? So
Sure.
we've talked about alpha, but also there's a training, I think, later on in the process of people coming to you, which is then on theta. And I was intrigued by that because you say that, for example, it's really only for people who have shown themselves to be quite ethical and cleansed.
Well, see, that's delta training.
Delta training. Yeah, okay. No, I mixed that up.
24 levels. We have 24 levels of the alpha training. You will be doing alpha 1 this week. And at least alpha 1 is a prerequisite for theta 1. People pretty much have alpha all the time. It can be big, it can be little, but it's always something to work with. Not so with theta. Theta is more binary. It's there or it's not there. And if it's not there, you can lie in theta, you lie in a recliner chair. Alpha, you need to sit upright. But in theta, you lie there and the monitor is suspended like this. So you open your eyes, look, see your scores. But if you don't have much theta, you may lie there for a half an hour and nothing much is happening. It'll be very frustrating. So each alpha you do produces more theta. In fact, the pattern of brainwaves in Zen is known. Advanced Zen, in a study done in Japan by 2 Japanese scientists, Kasumatsu and Hirai, revealed that nobody was rated advanced who had less than 21 years of daily Zen practice, and some had 40 years. And so 0 to 6 years practice, the Zen masters would usually categorize people as beginner. 6 to 21 years, they would be categorized as intermediate. And only starting at 21 years would they be characterized as advanced. Now, in beginning Zen, alpha increases at the back of the head. In intermediate, it does that and then spreads forward on the head. In advanced Zen, it does both of those things, but in addition, 2 more things happen. The frequency of the alpha slows a little, and you get theta waves emerging from the frontal locations. This is why I say that Biocybernaut Alpha training is like advanced Zen, 21 to 40 years of Zen in a week. Nobody had this pattern of advanced Zen who had less than 21 years, and some had to do 40. So Biocybernaut delivers 21 to 40 years of Zen practice in 7 days. Technology speeds things up. We can go into the details in a moment. But so theta is also a separate training, and there's 24 levels of the theta training. Now we also have 18 levels of the delta training. Now, if you talk to a neurologist and you tell them that people can be conscious in delta, they will say you're crazy. But they don't know. They only know Western medicine. Whereas, for example, Kundalini is characterized by high amplitude delta in 1 or more places on the head. When I had my first Kundalini awakening, I was actually being a participant in a theta training. I was lying there in the theta chair, and this enormous energy, like a freight train of energy, came up my spine, pushed everything, including my identity, to the far outer edges, and it was just like that. The energy totally came through. Was profoundly transformational. I was never the same after. And so the thing is that delta trainings confer siddhis or powers. And we don't want to create any Darth Vaders. So delta trainings are by invitation only. People have to have done enough alpha and enough theta trainings in order so that they can do ethical cleansing. Because if you have anger, fear, whatever, and you have delta, in fact, we had one person in training who was a former Special Forces American military. And when he was inducted into the Special Forces, he was measured, 12 ways from Sunday. His strength, his agility, his endurance, his marksmanship, and his brainwaves. And he was found to have naturally occurring delta. So he was put in a group with 99 other soldiers who also had delta, and they were used for targeted assassinations. They would be shown pictures or little movie clips that were shot through telephoto lenses of the target. Now, for some targets, they would take 20 or 30 of them, and they'd show them the pictures and the videos, and then they would ask them to go into delta and attempt to kill that person. For high-value targets who were well protected psychically on the other side, they would bring all 100 of them together. He said their effectiveness in killing the person was 80%.
How? I mean, how did they kill them?
By altering reality. Now, remember, I had a degree in physics, so if a physicist were to describe some aspect of reality, he would refer to it, you have neutrons and protons and electrons and so on. It's a soup of particles, and it's described by a quantum mechanical probability energy density function of this local piece of the universe. Now, to make this simple, you use noise-canceling earphones. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how do they work? Well, they detect the incoming waves, and they broadcast exactly those waves, same frequency, but 180 degrees out of phase, and so they basically turn noise into silence. Well, the Italian physicist de Broglie identified that all physical matter can be identified as a wave. They're called de Broglie waves. And so all you have to do is broadcast a frequency that's 180 degrees out of a living person's de Broglie waves, and they're not a living person anymore. It's like noise canceling writ large.
So they drop dead pretty much then?
Yes. Yes. And so this is a very great power. All humans have this potential, but I would not provide a delta training to somebody unless I had seen them do enough forgiveness, enough ethical cleansing. Well, like sometimes even well-intentioned. I had an elderly couple come from Arizona to California when I had my center there. They were both in their second marriage. They both had terrible abuse as children and in their first marriages. And the woman didn't know what happiness was. But she had become interested in psychic healing. And so she took some courses, watched some videos. And one night, she decided that she would send healing energy to this lady friend of hers. That night, that lady was rushed to the hospital and almost died. A week later, she did the same thing with another lady who was sick. That lady was rushed to the hospital and almost died. When it happened the third time, she goes, maybe I shouldn't be sending healing energy. She had delta waves. And so her conscious intent was to send healing energy, but the traumas, the unhealed traumas, were corrupting the waves, and what she was really sending was hatred and destruction in her delta waves. Yeah, exactly.
That's so wild.
Yeah.
That was crazy. But now, how many years have you worked on that? Because to come up with 18 delta or theta trainings and 24 alpha trainings,
theta, 18 delta.
18 delta.
Well, some of these, it's not possible to understand what they are until you've had some experience of the Alpha 1 training. And in fact, because you're doing the deluxe premium double, you will actually, by the 7th day, have all 12 channels of scores in all 12 tones that we normally don't start people in until they do their Alpha 2. You'll be getting a taste of it worked in, like on day 4, we'll introduce additional channels, day 5 and day 6 and day 7. So as we get a little bit into that, then we'll be able to talk about in a meaningful way what the higher levels of the training are about.
And for this round now, I have one remaining question. And you already mentioned some connection to a psychedelic experience. Like, how does that compare? An Alpha 1 training, let's say, and the psychedelic experience?
Well, a very simple way to understand any technique, whether it's fasting or sex or Sufi dancing or shamanic drumming or taking psychedelics or meditating, there's a simple way that you can understand all of these. It's actually a trademark of Biocybernaut, and the trademark is brainwaves rule. Your brainwaves rule your life. They rule your emotions. You cannot have the experience of the color blue unless you have the brainwaves for blue. And if you have your eyes closed and those brainwaves show up, you will see blue. And so brainwaves rule. And so it doesn't happen so much anymore, but it used to be, like in the 90s, people would come out of the chamber on day 3 and go, man, that was better than my best acid trip. Because when you produce the brainwaves for a certain state, you will experience that state. Now, you can produce these brainwaves by taking drugs, marijuana, psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, or by meditating, or by doing Sufi dancing, or by doing shamanic drumming, or by having sex, or by fasting. They only have an effect when they change the brainwaves. And so rather than doing this method to change your brainwaves, it's so much faster, easier, and more efficient to just change the brainwaves directly. In fact, I tell a little story there. In 1993, I published a paper showing that the then, not as powerful as now, the then Biocybernaut Alpha-1 training produced the same brainwaves as advanced Zen, 21 to 40 years of Zen in a week. That paper I published in 1993. And so I was invited by the head of the San Francisco Zen Center to come and talk to them about this work. They gave me a tour of the Zen Center, the big statue of Suzuki Roshi, who had founded the San Francisco. I actually have Suzuki Roshi's brainwaves. It was in his brainwaves and one other of his advanced monks that I discovered the brainwaves of halos, Heiligenschein. A halo exists in phase space over the head of somebody who is making simultaneously coherent theta and coherent alpha, and we can go through that. I can show you that.
You see that?
Well, people who can see auras see it. Absolutely. Visionary painters painted this for many, many years, even back in the Middle Ages. And so, yeah, there's a brainwave.
You see that in the numbers?
We can see that in the numbers, yeah. I can show you the graphs. So anyway, we saw Suzuki Roshi's statue and honored him. And I spoke about, having measured his brainwaves and having found the halo pattern there. It took a process of many years to really understand what that was. But so then we had tea, formal Japanese tea ceremony. And then the leader sits down, and they're all around. And he goes, now, they didn't disagree. They didn't argue. They said, we don't understand how you can produce the same results in 7 days that we Zen practitioners take 21 to 40 years to produce. The reason we don't understand is because we know you have to accumulate experience. And I go, you're absolutely right. You're right. You have to accumulate experience, but you can accumulate experience slowly or rapidly. Let me give you an example. I lived in San Francisco at the time. My house was on a steep hill, and I had terraced the hill, built walls, and it was the warmest area in San Francisco, little microclimates. It was ideal for blueberries. I love blueberries. Heidelbeeren, right? Okay, so, and I had bought early, mid-season, and late blueberries so that I would have blueberries all summer long. And I ordered them. They came. I dug the holes. I planted them. I watered them with water with vitamin B6 to stimulate root growth. Then I went inside. And the next morning, I came out to see how my blueberry plants were doing. They were all gone. Every single one had been pulled out of the ground and chewed up into little pieces, little twigs. And so I picked up, and they were muddy dog prints, because I'd done a lot, and they went up the back stairs of my neighbor's house. So I gathered up some of the broken, chewed twigs, and I went up the stairs and knocked on the door. And I said, look at what your dog did to my blueberries. Well, instead of being sympathetic or offering to replace the blueberries, they yelled at me. They said, you should have had a fence, and don't blame our dog, and, like that. Okay, so that night I'm in my home, in my meditation room, and I'm meditating, trying to meditate. And this dog starts barking. And I go off on this angry rant. Oh my God, there's that dog, and why didn't they? And they should have. And 15 minutes of angry inner dialogue. And then I wake up, oh, I'm supposed to be meditating. Okay. And I tell the Zen guys, that's one experience. It took me 15 minutes to have that one experience. Now, if you were in the Biocybernaut chamber, minimum, even on day one, you're going to have 4 tones. each one of the tones is going to be adjusted 50 times per second. So the volume of the tone follows the volume of your brainwaves. So if you listen to the tones, you're going to have 200 opportunities per second to learn, to accumulate experience. And then we add, a few days later, 2 more tones. So then you have 300 opportunities per second to learn. And so 1 experience for 15 seconds. You guys are absolutely right. You do have to accumulate experience, but you can accumulate it slowly, like in meditation, or you can accumulate it rapidly in the Biocybernaut feedback chamber. Technology speeds things up.
Beautiful. Doc, I think by now we'll stop for now, and we'll continue later on. All right. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.